Did your parents love you enough to teach you the difference between a bolt carrier for an AR-15 and an M16? Or the dangers of fiat currency? Or how to celebrate Donald Trump's caveman energy? These are all real lessons from children's books written for conservative parents to foist upon their kids. And I read a couple of these books to get an idea of just how much propaganda can be crammed into a brightly colored kids' book. Historian Robert Hine wrote, "What society wants its children to know reveals what that society wants itself to be. And while these books are very transparent in their goals, what I didn't expect to find when I read them is that they're often just as detailed as the arguments you would hear from conservative pundits." Before going through some of these books, let's go back in time to understand where these conservative children's books came from. Children's stories go back many centuries, and we probably all grew up hearing some variation of Little Red Riding Hood or Goldilocks and the Three Bears. These simple fables are a mix of entertainment and simple morals, like not talking to wolfish strangers or not breaking into someone's house to eat their porridge. Although many of these stories were passed down orally, eventually they found their way into books, where they could be collected for posterity, entertaining and educating children for many years to come. Some books were less tactful, though, and made little or no attempt at weaving together some kind of narrative to entertain a child. They just straight up told kids how to behave. If we go back to the 17th century, we can find handy guides such as Youth's Behavior, or Decency in Conversation Amongst Men composed in French by grave persons for the use and benefit of their youth, now newly turned into English, by Francis Hawkins. Or this lovely book, The School of Manners from 1701, which offered advice such as eat not too fast or grittily, and eat not so slow as to make others wait for thee. Many of these books were about how children should behave, instilling in them ironclad rules at how to sit around the dinner table. But more interesting were the books that taught children how to think. While I'm going to be talking about books on the right side of the political spectrum, they certainly aren't the only ones doing this. Some examples from the left include Heather Has Two Mommies by Leslie Newman and Diana Souza, A is for Activist by Innocento Nagata, and Tango Makes Three by Justin Richardson and Peter Parnell. There are plenty of left-wing children's books out there. But right-wing children's books are a little different. These books are written less for kids and more for their parents. In Raising Your Kids Right, Children's Literature and American Political Conservatism, English professor Michelle Ann Abate puts the start of this in the 1990s with books such as Politically Correct Bedtime Stories. Although taking the guise of a children's book, it's clearly written for an older audience wanting to laugh at the supposed excesses of PC culture in the 1990s. Over time, though, more sincere versions of these books started being produced for kids, often as extensions of the brand identities of public figures, including conservative pundits such as Bill O'Reilly with his Kids Are Americans Too book. Here's a taste of what that book is like. Knowing your rights and respecting them will make you a better person and a more successful one. Just by reading this book, you are demonstrating that you are way ahead of the pack. It's doubtful that Britney Spears would have read this book when she was your age, and look what's happened to her. The woman keeps forgetting her undergarments. I guess she has a right to do that, but, I mean, come on. This book obviously hasn't aged too well, but if you want a glimpse into the pop culture of the mid-2000s from a guy who is in his 50s, this book is great for that. Not all books in this space are quite as obnoxious, though. It was around this time in the 90s and 2000s that books were suddenly being written by public figures such as Lynn Cheney, a wife of former Vice President Dick Cheney. And there were a few breakout titles such as William Bennett's The Book of Virtues, and Catherine Debrecht, who wrote a whole series of books beginning with Help, Mom, There Are Liberals Under My Bed. One of the highest-selling series of these conservative books for kids is The Tuttle Twins by Connor Boyak and Elijah Stanfield. They've sold over 4 million copies, according to their website, are endorsed by Glenn Beck, and they have enough cash to produce a commercial like this.
The Tuttle Twins is a book series written by freedom-loving parents who wanted to protect their kids from socialist ideas and empower kids everywhere to learn why free markets and individual rights are so important.
These books are about two twins named Ethan and Emily who learn important lessons such as how to put together an effective business plan or that taxation for social programs is theft. Of the few of these books I read from this series, there often isn't much in the way of plot. It usually starts with a premise, such as Ethan and Emily wanting to open a theater, and they then turn to a family member or close friend who delivers a very long lecture about the proper way of doing or understanding something, as the twins move through each step. Here's a quick excerpt where the twins learn about the law from Fred, some old guy who lives in their neighborhood. The bad guys in government take my things and give them to others without my permission. Sometimes they take my things to keep for themselves, or give away to their friends instead of helping the needy, Fred told them. They sound like they are pirates, Ethan said, imagining Fred walking the plank at the point of his sword. Fred chuckled. Yes, Ethan, pirates steal things, that's called plunder. And if bad guys in government do it, we call that legal plunder. According to Fred, this leads to people demanding the government plunder from others, and we get an absolutely wild image of protesters. We see people protesting for schools alongside others, demanding bank bailouts and pipelines, and some truly bizarre protesters demanding prices be raised. While the depiction of the left and corporate interests working in lockstep is a complete fantasy, the Tuttle Twins books do, at least, have a coherent ideology they're pushing. It's a vision of libertarianism that's been simplified for children to understand, where free markets solve every problem and capitalist benefactors exist to make people's dreams come true. It's the sort of free market libertarianism most people find compelling if their only experience with literature is reading a book by Ayn Rand. While this worldview seems to me silly, at least the Tuttle Twins books can be claiming to be fighting for something. Other right-wing books are not so carefully crafted. Instead of presenting broad values or ideological primers, some books are just reviewing topics in modern-day culture wars, with thin narratives often pushing messages and topics that would likely go over the head of an 8-year-old. And Scott McCloud, a critic of children's literature, described it saying, "Adults write the books that children read. They edit them, publish them, buy them, promote them, read them to children, and teach them. They have a stake in the representations that are found in those books, and in the ideological messages they, overtly or covertly, contain. Children's literature provides a unique window into the pervasive values and deeply held beliefs of a culture. There are some right-wing books that reflect a culture that is less driven by a coherent ideology, but rather a vague animosity towards the left and a series of shallow culture war issues. Let's look at one of the books from the Donald the Caveman series by Eric Metaxas and Tim Raglan. This one is titled Donald Builds the Wall. The reference, I should hope, is painfully obvious, at least to adults. While kids may be aware of the phrase, many of the jokes and gags here are clearly intended for an older audience. For example, when describing the less desirables of this caveman culture, there's one excerpt that reads, "Some broke things and some even stole. The worst was a vicious gang called MSNBC 13. And right there, you have two references that the average kid probably won't get. I doubt any of them are watching MSNBC or have even heard of MS-13. And we just get more of this as the book goes on to include crude caricatures of Bernie Sanders and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. There's also a tree of blue birds that are clearly meant as a reference to Twitter. And we even get a swamp creature called George-osaurus, because it just wouldn't be conservative propaganda without an anti-Semitic dog whistle. Most of this book seems as though it was written less to entertain kids and more to make their parents smugly smile as they read their child the story for the 100th time. There also isn't much of a moral here outside of glamorizing the border wall promised by former President Trump. And outside of references to people and groups in the real world, the book has a striking similarity to right-wing talking points about a border wall in general. A wall is built and does its job perfectly in this story, which is the exact same logic used by former President Trump and his supporters who don't consider ladders or someone just breaking through the wall. Much like the children's book, this policy idea lives in the world of fantasy. Now, it would be incredibly silly of me to make fun of a children's book for not having a nuanced discussion about border security, and that's not the point I'm trying to make here. What I'm trying to say is that this much beloved security idea from the Trump administration is something a child would suggest, understood and presented with simple, basic rhetoric. And it really reflects the shape of conservative rhetoric in the modern day, simplified to something that could fit on a bumper sticker. And this is a pattern I saw many times over in some of these kids' books. Instead of seeing simplified versions of arguments for right-wing ideas, the ideas were instead just being repeated the same way you would hear them coming from right-wing commentators. Only they're coming out of the mouth of a cartoon animal in a picture book, rather than a weirdo in a suit shouting it into a camera. This reflects a shift in right-wing culture. Whereas the Tuttle Twins are pushing libertarianism to a new generation, books like the Caveman Donald series are about glorifying Trump and his simplistic policy ideas. Neither of these books are ones I'd put in the hands of a child, but one is driven by ideology and the other by issues of the day. A more alarming right-wing kids book is Brian Lenny's Why Everyone Needs an AR-15. This book is a guide for children to learn all about AR-15s. The existence of this book in and of itself is already pretty depressing. But I suppose this comes from someone who wants children to be familiar with a weapon before seeing someone try to shoot their school up with one. The book is written in a way that made me think it might be a parody at times. For instance, it spends the first few pages explaining how the AR-15 differs from the M16, and we see their respective parts in an image. This is the most detailed image we see in the book. The rest of it is filled with stick figures firing weapons. It also presents AR-15s as though they're toys. Here's an excerpt. With all the cool things you can add to the AR-15, it's like a Lego toy for adults. 2 pages later, it does warn kids not to use one without an adult supervising, though perhaps, and this is a bold suggestion, children shouldn't be using guns at all. But one thing I noticed throughout this book is that many of the points it makes are identical to what you would hear from gun rights proponents, such as criminals being able to access guns regardless of laws, or comparing the number of people killed by guns as people hit by cars. It really enforces how silly these arguments are when they're the sort of things one would tell a child. Unfortunately, this was not Lenny's only book. He also wrote, "Why is feminism so silly?" Here's an excerpt from that one. So, what are feminists mad about? This is why feminism is silly, because women in America have all the same rights that men do, and even special rights to help them. But feminists still think that women have such a tough life, all because of the patriarchy. Well, that's crazy. I know this book is intended for children, but the writing here is almost insulting. It just makes vague points about why women have it good, and then goes on with, "Aren't feminists silly?" There's even one page that reads like this. "Some women like making sandwiches in the kitchen. Whether it's peanut butter and jelly or ham and mayo, it doesn't matter, because a lot of women want to stay home and make sandwiches instead of going to a job every day, and that's okay. What kind of sandwich do you like to eat?" The demand that women make men sandwiches is a refrain that has been typically used against women. It was never about whether or not women should feel bad about making sandwiches. It was telling women that their place was in the kitchen. It's pretty stunning, albeit not surprising, for a book to be claiming that feminists have nothing to complain about while making an explicitly sexist point. This is another right-wing children's book that is fully engaged in the culture war. It doesn't really stand for anything, aside from vague egalitarianism and pro-Americanism. Its main goal is to go after a perceived threat, in this case feminists, and making sure kids know that they are the enemy. Perhaps one of the clearest examples of a right-wing kids book that says virtually nothing aside from vague gesturing against the other side is Matt Walsh and Kay Reese's Johnny the Walrus. The story in this book, if you can call it that, is of a boy named Johnny who wants to be a walrus, and his mother who encourages him to follow that dream. An obvious analogy to being trans that struggles to make any kind of sense, but the part at the end is where it really tells on itself. When Johnny and his mom go to the zoo so Johnny can join the other walruses, they meet an author insert of Matt Walsh, who is cast himself as the guy who sweeps up after the walruses. In a more just world, Matt Walsh would be the guy who cleans up walrus crap at the zoo, and would be doing a better day's work than the stuff he does now. But in the context of this book, he's there to deliver some common sense to Johnny's mother, and have really weird-looking forearms. "Ma'am, that's just a boy with wood spoons in his mouth." The lesson learned, if we can call it that, isn't even really for Johnny, but rather Johnny's mother. She learns the importance of not listening to voices on the internet, which are clearly a stand-in for trans activists. Instead, she should listen to common sense from Matt Walsh, who is, by the way, a voice from the internet. Walrus crap shoveler Matt Walsh did all of this using a thought-terminating cliche. Although it's written to sound like common sense, it really disguises a lack of nuance or understanding of an issue. Pretending being a walrus is the same as being trans is a mask for using that technique. I wasn't the only one to take a look at this particular children's book.
Okay, if I can just cut in here real quick, sorry. So this whole being a walrus is the same as being trans thing is actually even more insidious than that. So basically, Matt Walsh is using this extended metaphor for being trans, and the insidiousness comes from how bad of a metaphor it is. As an analogy, it sucks. Gender is nothing like species. One is a social construct, and the other is, as Matt Walsh would say, just basic biology. And being trans isn't just playing pretend. It's not something that evil internet people force onto kids. Now, I have been doing a lot of reading on the cognitive linguistics of metaphors, because I am very cool and definitely have a very robust social life. And basically, the metaphors that we use to conceptualize things can actually change how we think about things. Our language has a real substantial effect on our cognitive frameworks. So when we have these inaccurate and harmful metaphors about how being trans is like playing pretend, and how we shouldn't listen to trans activists, and how gender is the same as species, we're creating these mental frameworks that lead down the road to transphobia. So make better analogies, Matt. Like, I know it's a kid's book, but maybe put more effort into using a metaphor that doesn't break down at the surface level. I'd say stick to writing movies, but you're not very good at those either, so maybe just don't write, like, at all, anything. Am I being too mean to him? I mean, he is a transphobic asshole, so it. Anyway, if you would like to hear me rant about more bad metaphors in kids' books, I have made a companion video to this one over on my channel, so feel free to pop over there when you are done with this one. Back to you, Jose. Over and out. I never know how to end these.
Thanks, Zoe, and now back to my video. Kids don't transition because their parents are under pressure from online activists. It's usually a process that involves doctors who provide a diagnosis and treatment methods to ensure that the child has the best life possible. While it might be convenient to say a children's book doesn't have space for that kind of understanding, a more likely reason is that by omitting the opinions of experts in the field, it's easier to deliver simplistic propaganda. About a month and a half after this book was published, Walsh continued his war of hatred against trans people in a movie titled, What is a Woman? And while Johnny the Walrus is a book intended for children, this movie for adults has the same level of depth and understanding of trans people. That is, it's something that a person with a childlike understanding of trans issues might be convinced by, but probably wouldn't work on anyone who understands the basics of what it means to be trans. What is a Woman uses the same thought-terminating cliches to deceive its audience into thinking doctors and professors are full of crap. It makes no attempt to understand more complicated definitions of womanhood to reinforce its prejudice. When a gender studies professor tries to answer the question, what is a woman, the movie cuts the answer up and plays music over it, so the audience is kept ignorant.
Leading about that characterization is allowed to be sort of messy and complicated. But in that framing, when you split them up into these wholly discrete constructs, studies scholars, and really more specific.
Matt Walsh is using the same level of childlike thinking he puts into his children's book. What is a Woman even has a section trying to equate being trans to thinking you're another species, something that isn't even true of the person he brought on to speak to.
Are you able to communicate with the wolves?
Am I going to have a conversation with a wolf in the way that I'm communicating you and I? Obviously not. Am I going to read their body language, respond appropriately to their behaviors and their nonverbal cues? Yes.
For a more full breakdown of this movie, I recommend this video by Jesse Gender that can more fully explain why it's so wrong. Johnny the Walrus is the same type of propaganda designed to spread anti-trans hate, and it uses the same arguments. And in some ways, it's a bit more scary. A lot of the lessons being taught to kids here aren't seeds being planted to create a greater understanding of the world. They're edicts being impressed upon them, so they will grow up with a stripped-down understanding of the world around them. It's teaching kids to be ignorant and to try and stay that way. In many ways, these books are similar to the guidebooks I highlighted early on, only instead of teaching kids on how to use a napkin, it's teaching them to hate trans people. Back in 1994, James Finn Garner's Politically Correct Bedtime Stories was published. And while some of the particulars have changed, the general idea should be very familiar. Here's an excerpt from the introduction to its 2010 ebook edition. In the self-righteous Copenhagen of Hans Christian Andersen, the inalienable rights of mermaids were hardly given a second thought. Today, we have the opportunity, and the obligation, to rethink these classic stories so they reflect more enlightened times. To that effort, I submit this humble book. The book maintains that ironic tone throughout all its stories. Here's one sample from its version of Little Red Riding Hood. This comes at the point of the story where Little Red Riding Hood is about to be devoured by the wolf. Her screams were heard by a passing woodchopper person, or log fuel technician as he preferred to be called. When he burst into the cottage, he saw the melee and tried to intervene. But as he raised his axe, Red Riding Hood and the wolf both stopped. "And just what do you think you're doing?" asked Red Riding Hood. The woodchopper person blinked and tried to answer, but no words came to him. "Bursting in here like a Neanderthal, trusting your weapon to do your thinking for you," she exclaimed. "Sexist, speciesist. How dare you assume that women and wolves can't solve their own problems without a man's help?" When she heard Red Riding Hood's impassioned speech, Grandma jumped out of the wolf's mouth, seized the woodchopper person's axe, and cut his head off. After this ordeal, Red Riding Hood, Grandma, and the wolf felt a certain commonality of purpose. They decided to set up an alternative household based on mutual respect and cooperation, and they lived together in the woods, happily ever after. Much like all of the other stories I read in this book, you should notice the pattern here is less about presenting a coherent worldview, or even a basic set of morals, but rather it's an elaborate excuse to dunk on the left, or rather, what they imagine the left to be. This book of fairy tales sneers at the very idea of reimagining, deconstructing, or in some way trying to think more deeply about a piece of art. These stories aren't genuine attempts to engage with the source material. It just uses it as more fuel for the culture war, tacitly saying that these fairy tales, which have gone through centuries of changes and revisions by the way, should never be updated. It manages to misunderstand both art and history while venerating the idea that thinking about traditions is for less clever people. The big difference between this book of stories and the children's books I highlighted earlier is that this one was at least aware enough of itself to be marketed towards adults, an audience that's probably more capable of engaging with the dunk. But it also reflects just how basic these dunks are. The ones written for adults and the ones written for kids have the same level of sophistication. In fact, by marketing these books to children, the goal is to effectively broadcast the ultimate form of a thought-terminating cliché, a lesson taught to children to think less and simply accept the world for what it is, never trying to imagine a better tomorrow or a version of themselves that isn't the one that their parents have already decided for them. The real tragedy here is for any kids who are given these books, not just because they're awful, but because they try to undo the best part about being a kid, having an open mind to a world full of possibilities. And books should be an open doorway into these new worlds. But these books are about closing those doors and telling them to live in the world that their parents give them. I've always been really curious about these weird children's books that are written by conservative authors, and having read several of them, I'm kind of blown away at the incredibly low quality, not just of the writing, but the artwork as well. I didn't even get to the one where it's all about how socialism is evil, or the one that just highlights history from the perspective of Rush Limbaugh. I'd like to get to some of these in the future, and if this video does particularly well, maybe I'll get back to that. It was a blast either way. Much thanks to Zoe B for agreeing to do this collaboration with me. She was wonderful to work with, and go check out her video and channel for some more great stuff. Also, thank you to the patrons and members whose names should be scrolling up the screen. These are the people who help make videos like this possible by agreeing to support me financially. I am incredibly grateful, and if you'd like to be one of them and get your name in the credits, you can become a patron or member. You'll also get early access to videos and some other fun bonuses. If you would like to support this channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, and by the way, hit the bell for notifications so you'll always know what cool stuff is happening on the channel. Thank you all so much for watching.